Hi, I'm Esther Zarifi and I'm here to talk to you about understanding exam assessment in religious studies. To best prepare candidates for their summative examined assessment in RS, it's important that teachers understand the way that this type of assessment works. Designing exam assessment is a lengthy process that involves many layers of scrutiny to ensure that all candidates have fair access to the final examinations. There's all sorts of factors such as language, accessibility, and avoidance of bias that need to be considered when writing assessment material. All of these things can prove challenging. In this presentation, I'll discuss the key principles of assessment, question types and assessment objectives specific to religious studies, and then mark schemes and marking. That is point marking and levels of response marking. When we're designing assessments, some of the principles we take into consideration are that the questions reflect the content that's set out in the specification, that students can complete the paper in the time that they're allowed. The questions need to clearly tell the students what they need to do. And the mark scheme then needs to reward students of all abilities for what they know and what they can do. Hopefully you've seen our short video on the general principles of assessment. If so, you'll be familiar with key terms like validity, reliability, and comparability. However, I would like to remind you of one of the key things we must strive for in assessment, and that is differentiation. This is achieved when an exam paper provides opportunities for students across the ability range to show what they know, understand, and can do. By differentiating effectively, an exam is likely to distinguish between students. If they all get full marks, we haven't provided a good assessment. By ensuring that the entire mark range is used, we can separate students based on the evidence of their knowledge and skills as they've shown in their answers. The way we gather this evidence of what students have shown us that they know and they can do is by measuring their performance against assessment objectives. Our RS papers follow a clear and consistent assessment design. This enables us to measure students against the AOs that are set by Ofqual for both A-level and GCSE qualifications. In RS, we have two AOs, or assessment objectives. AO1 is split into 3 strands at GCSE. This is 4 at A-level, and it tests knowledge and understanding. AO2 looks at skills of evaluation and analysis. Both of these skills are important in the study of this subject, as students need to be able to demonstrate knowledge, but also to be able to apply and analyse this knowledge in order to be critical thinkers and effectively engage with important issues. You can see that although both levels follow similar AOs, the wording at A-level increases the demand and moves that thinking on to a higher level. Our assessments follow a clear structure that is based on the 2 assessment objectives. As you can see, for example, on the GCSE Spec A, the 1-mark multiple choice, the 2-mark and the 5-mark questions are always designed to assess AO 1.1. Knowledge and understanding of beliefs, practices, and sources of authority. The 4-mark questions on Paper 1 beliefs will always ask for influences, which assesses AO 1.2. And the 4 markers on Paper 1 practices and on the themes will always assess the 3rd strand of AO1, that is the contrast and similarities within and between religions and beliefs. You can see the breakdown for Spec B and Short Course on screen or on the Teaching Guide web pages. It's also noticeable that the command words change as the question types move up the mark tariff, and they therefore demand more in terms of skills. So we move from a multiple choice to a give question and then on to explain and then those evaluate questions. AO2 analysis and evaluation is always assessed through at GCSE through the 12-mark extended answer questions. They always give a statement and then use the phrase evaluate this statement as the command. At A-level, 10-mark AO1 questions will be asked throughout the philosophy, ethics and religions sections. AO2 is then assessed in the 15-mark questions. Then finally, in paper 2 dialogues, students are assessed via 25-mark questions that combine both the AO1 10 marks and the AO2 15 marks. This allows for synoptic links to be made across spec content. Right, I've got an activity for you now to put what I've just been through into practice. Using the assessment objectives and the tables that I've just shown you, alongside your spec content, I'd like you to write some quick questions on the following sections. So for GCSE, have a go at a 2-mark question on themes, a 4-mark question on paper 1 beliefs, and then a 4-mark question on paper 1 practices. Make sure you check which assessment objectives they need to relate to. And then for A-level, a 10-mark question. Hopefully, in doing that activity, you've come up with a question for GCSE that asks about influences, that is the second strand of AO1, for the beliefs 4 marker, as that will always be the question type there. And for practices, I hope you came up with a contrast question. For the 2 marker, there shouldn't be any requirement to contrast or ask for an influence. The item should just ask students to give to. The A-level 10 marker you've written should be an examine question from any area of the spec content. Doing this again across all the item types, I think could be a really useful activity that will help in designing your own practice questions to use with your students in the future. Understanding where the assessment objectives appear in the examinations, especially at GCSE, can also help with specification delivery. For example, when you're covering the Spec A beliefs content, you now know that the 4-mark question would always ask your students about influences. So you can build in those activities or that discussion about how the belief in, for example, the resurrection of Jesus would influence Christians today, and so on and so on. And so you can build some activities that relate directly to how those assessment objectives are going to appear on that final exam. We'll now look in more detail at one question type that's used at GCSE, and that is the multiple choice question. Recall of facts or terminology might be assessed through these shorter questions, which means also that the first question on the paper is accessible to the full range of student abilities. This can help build their confidence as they progress through to those items with the higher levels of demand. The accessibility of the multiple choice questions also results in fewer unanswered questions on the paper overall, which ultimately helps with standard setting and awarding. Multiple choice questions, or MCQs, when they're designed well, they can validly test various areas of the spec in a short amount of time. On the slide, you'll see that there's several parts to a multiple choice question. The stem is the beginning part of the item that presents the question. The options are then all the possible answers. So in our case, there's 4 options. The correct answer is the key, and the incorrect answers we call the distractors. The question stem needs to be written as succinctly as possible in order to allow all students to understand what is being asked of them. Any unnecessary information needs to be removed, and the wording should remain minimal. MCQs, such as the one shown on screen, can be really helpful in the classroom as a way of testing the knowledge of topics and revising an area quickly. They could be built into starters or plenaries as a way to assess understanding from a lesson and quickly to identify misconceptions. And this allows teaching to be reactive. They can also be a tool for starting discussions around a topic and a quick revision exercise. If you are going to write your own MCQs, it's worth us looking at some useful principles in how we design them. The question needs to give a clear and concise instruction. The options should be of comparable lengths so that no one option stands out too much as the correct or incorrect answer. The options should also include plausible distractors. In other words, they need to be at least related to the subject matter so that they can't be eliminated by students who do not know the correct answer. Answering MCQs should take students 1 mark worth of exam time. So in GCSE RS terms, that's about a minute. So the items shouldn't be too wordy or it'll take them too long to read through the question stem and all the options and then think of their answer. Have a look at the MCQ on the screen. Based on the principles I've just been through, how could this question be improved? So here we have a question that says, the festival that remembers the Buddha's birth, enlightenment and death is called A. Enlightenment, B. Karuna, B. Wesak, or D. Holi. If we remember the principles, that the distractors should be in alphabetical order, we ensure all distractors are plausible, and we shouldn't use an option within the question stem. As it stands, it wouldn't assess the content as accurately as it might. Firstly, the distractors aren't all plausible, as they aren't all Buddhist practices, which means a student who's revised their Buddhist practices could rule out option D, Holi, straight away, as that's a Hindu festival. So therefore, that reduces the level of demand. Secondly, the term enlightenment is in the question and in the options. And so that could be really confusing, especially if it was the correct answer in this case, and it would compromise the validity of the question. Also, when we're writing an MCQ, the distractors are always listed in alphabetical order to remove any sense of bias or pattern, which could be unintentionally written into the question. The question, when it appeared on our GCSE paper, actually looked like this, which you can see works far better and meets all those design principles. The question actually read, which one of the following is the festival that remembers the Buddha's birth, enlightenment and death? And so we've got a question that clearly tells the student what they need to do. And then the options were Karuna, Samatha, Vesak and Zazen. So they were all terminology from the Buddhism paper, and they were written in alphabetical order. They were all about the same length, and none of the words from the question appeared as options, as they did in my previous example. As we've tried to show you through that quick look at an MCQ example, the language used as well as other factors need to be carefully considered when we're drafting questions. As such, during the question paper production process, all our items go through rigorous checks and a series of revisions if needed. Our teams consider things including the use of command words, whether the questions relate clearly to specification content. Checks might also ask things such as, is the question concise? Could the order of the wording be improved? What answer do we actually want to elicit from the students? In other words, which part of the spec content are we wanting to test them on? I asked our assessment design team to share some examples of what this process looks like. And as you'll be able to see from this 2021 GCSE question, careful revisions were made here. The draft and final version, although they assess the same content, are clearly different. The final question is far more concise and removes the unnecessary and possibly confusing phrase, the worldwide community. I'll also show you now an example of a 12-mark question statement from the 2022 GCSE Christianity paper. You can see that the draft version was quite long, and the key idea about adult or infant baptism was somewhat lost. That would or could have impacted quite significantly on the accessibility of this question. And the final version, though, that reads, "Only adults should be baptised into the Christian religion," is far more concise and tests the subject knowledge more directly, which ultimately is going to give us a more valid assessment outcome. So far, we've talked about assessment principles and question types. Finally, I'd like to spend some time considering the two types of mark scheme and therefore the two approaches to marking that we have in exam RS. Alongside the exam paper, the mark scheme is crucial in ensuring effective standardisation across students and therefore the reliability of our assessments. A mark scheme is developed alongside the question paper, and before the final wording of questions is decided, the mark scheme is structured to ensure that the focus of assessment is rewarded correctly. It's the same as planning a lesson, essentially. Teachers know and understand the objectives of their lesson before they design the content and activities as ways to deliver and achieve those objectives. In the same way, we know our assessment objectives, where they fit into the question structure, and the content that we want to assess. The wording of the mark scheme is critical and needs to ensure that it will allow students to be credited for correct responses, even if they're not the answers that were originally anticipated. During the standardisation process, once scripts have been seen by senior examiners, the mark scheme content is often added to or amended to reflect common or previously unexpected answers. In RS, we use two approaches to mark schemes and marking, that is point-based marking and levels of response marking. Point-based marking is used in short or low tariff questions at GCSE. This type of mark scheme enables examiners to reward students on a point-by-point basis. For example, on a 2-mark question, ultimately the examiner is looking for whether the student has stated 2 correct points in their answer. Or on a 4-mark question, 1 mark is awarded for a simple point. The 2nd mark is awarded for development of that point through the inclusion of additional detail or examples. Essentially, then, the examiner is counting up a point and a development or detail, and then a 2nd point and a development or detail to award that mark out of 4. For open-ended questions, it's often best to use a levels of response mark scheme, as this gives you some flexibility in awarding marks for merit, even if the student's response is unexpected. Although assessment writing teams try to consider many possible answers, until the exam has been sat, it's hard to gauge exactly how a question will be received. For this reason, indicative content is built into a mark scheme to highlight the most likely answers. Therefore, levels of response mark schemes are used often when there's multiple ways a student could approach a question and still be successful. They're also used when assessing skills, in our case, in our AO2 evaluation questions, in addition to just the knowledge-based questions. Levels of response are used throughout the A-level and at GCSE for the higher tariff 12-mark questions. Using a levels of response mark scheme requires a different approach to marking from a points-based mark scheme, and this distinction is really important. When you're marking a longer response, such as a GCSE 12 marker or an A-level answer, you would be told as an examiner to read the whole answer before awarding the level. In other words, you're not checking off points as they are made like you would on a 2 marker or another short question. This way, the full response would be considered and you'd get the best fit in terms of the level identified. There's full instructions on how to apply levels of response in the opening section of all our published mark schemes. The levels might include a cap on marks depending on criteria. For example, as you can see from the table, at GCSE there is a cap of level 2 for a one-sided response. That is one that includes a point of view, as the levels say, and also a cap for answers that are purely secular. So on reading the whole answer, you can easily see if it would be capped at 6 out of 12. Either way, you then need to read the level descriptors and see if the answer meets all the criteria set out. To achieve level 4 at GCSE, answers need to include judgments. In other words, students need to include an evaluation of the statement. Do they overall agree or disagree with the statement? And they need to give the reasons for this judgment. For example, are arguments and evidence strong or weak? Why? Students can include evaluation throughout their answer if they wish, in a conclusion at the end, or even make their judgment at the beginning and then build up their argument. The mark scheme for these questions is as inclusive as possible. All relevant material will be credited, but the key to the high levels is making sure that the statement from the question is fully addressed within their answer. The 12-mark question is a very effective differentiator. And so, although aiming for level 4 is great, for many students, being able to gain 5, 6 or 7 out of 12 on an extended response question at this level would be a fantastic achievement. Remember, a good assessment will differentiate between students and thus produce valid results overall. Our A-level RS assessments are always marked using levels of response. There are separate level descriptors for A01 and for A02. You can see here that A02 descriptors include a cap at level 2 for a one-sided response, and that for level 3 and above, answers need to include evaluation supported by reasoning. It's really useful, I think, to share these mark schemes with students at both GCSE and A-level, so that they can not only judge the level of their own work, but by understanding how their work is assessed, they can then develop understanding of how to improve their exam techniques. Mark schemes can be useful for marking assessments too, as they provide ready-made feedback that you can give to students. As well as self and teacher assessment, students could also be shown example answers across the question types and could mark them together or individually. These activities can help to demystify the examinations and then build confidence in students as they prepare for their final assessments in religious studies. Thank you.